Okay, so I quite often say that maybe you should watch Tom Bukovac with your coffee and then watch my videos on the toilet if you've got a minute. Tom just put up a video Tuesday called Garbage Time, and I thought it had some really interesting points in it. It had basically a question from a subscriber of his asking his advice for someone wanting to be a session musician. He said in that it was basically really difficult to give that kind of advice because there's so much, but I thought he did have some really key tidbits of information, as well as some advice from other stuff that I've seen of his that I kind of thought, well, let's just do a little video on that and highlight some of these cool points that Tom made. Hopefully that's okay with you. And now I'm going to play an introduction with some of Tom's pet hates.
This channel is supported by TrueFire. TrueFire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses.
If you like the tones in the intro there, they were from the Amp in the Room tones, the Dumble, one of those, so you grab them in the Gumroad for a £5. So, the first really important point that I think Tom made was that I think you need to be listening to a lot of music, you know, seeing how much you can learn from great records. And I guess we're really here talking about kind of records that people like Tom Bukovac have played on. So you could think about some kind of Rascal Flatts stuff. I think of some really great stuff like Shania Twain's Man, I Feel Like a Woman, which I think Dan Huff was playing on that session, and maybe Brent Mason as well. I think there is a lesson in there that the guys that are on these gigs and are playing in these sessions, I think Nashville was actually a little bit of a forgotten era. Like, they're still doing things in Nashville that they don't really do the rest of the world over. But the guys that are on those gigs are going to stay on those gigs for an awfully long time, and in those sessions, those are the real experts. There's not actually a ton of session work necessarily left for a lot of other players. And I think someone like Rob Harris, who plays for Jamiroquai, does a lot of session playing in the UK. I think it's more moved to remote session playing being the thing for a lot of the rest of the world. But in any case, I think what a lot of the great session players share in common, what Tom's saying, is that you need to be really listening to a lot of music and not just the guitar. And this is, I think, something that I've throughout my life, you know, I'm just a bedroom guitarist that's achieved nothing. However, I do still think that I have some of these skills that would have been useful if I ever got an opportunity. One of the things that I used to do would be, like, after working in a supermarket, I would come home on the weekend or whatever if I had a day off, and I would try to put together like a cover which was covering basically all of the parts. So it might be like a 1975 song. You can find these on my SoundCloud if you're looking for them, or a Bon Iver tune, Bon Iver, however you say it, you know, Jeff Buckley or things like this. So this was at a stage when I was actually singing as well, and you'd play the bass, you'd play all the parts, you'd listen to the synths and try and program them, and you'd put together a full like arrangement, and maybe you try and get it close, or maybe you try and do your own thing with it. I think I've done Taylor Swift tunes as well. But I think that's the key, that a lot of the session players are multi-instrumentalists, one. Two, they've listened to things, they can arrange, and they can probably sing, a lot of them as well. And I think that would be a really good advice if you're a young musician. If you can sing as well as play guitar, I think you've got a much higher potential of getting a bunch of work, listening to tunes in detail. And sort of when we're doing kind of function gigs, it's really easy to gloss over details because you've got like a high volume of work to do and learn. But I think the more kind of detailed listening you do to some tunes, the more you get out of it, and the more you start to appreciate like what goes into a tune like Man, I Feel Like a Woman, like how much of a great solo there is on that, and what a kind of magical session it ends up being. One of the other things that he mentioned, they're not that interested in sort of flashy playing and stuff like that, which has been basically what I spent a lot of my life working on. Which was useful for the one time I got called up for one of these things, you know, like working with the keyboard player from Meridian in Real World Studios. That's kind of like my thing that I was working towards. I thought one day I might get a call to do something. I did get a call for it, and I think based on the feedback and stuff, the session went pretty well. Anyway, talked about, you're not necessarily, like the song will be written probably, and the parts will be there already. They're looking for you to kind of add a bit of you to the tune and elements, or listen for things that might elevate the tune. And one thing that he talked about was just, and I did that in the intro a bit, kind of just recording a few phrases in a middle eight. It was what he talked about. And just go and then reverse those phrases and see what comes out, and you could maybe chop those up and turn them into something at the DAW or on the session. And that was just kind of one of these really key little bits of wisdom. You know, there's loads of this kind of sprinkled throughout Tom Bukovac's videos, and like little bits of knowledge that really you're not going to get necessarily from a bedroom unless you're watching these things and listening to the pros talk about them. And I think it's a really cool idea. And you could even have like a reverse delay. I think this is a Jimi Hendrix thing, really, right? I think he did a bunch of this. Eric Johnson, I know for sure, has done a bunch of this. But something that is not so much about, you know, technicality or anything other than really knowing that texturally doing this sort of thing could actually add like an otherworldly texture to your song, or this section of a song that might pique interest and, you know, draw attention, someone's ear. I think that was a really cool thing. Another thing that he talked about was kind of a plinky sound. He talked about plugging straight into an amp and turning the volume right down. And that's kind of one of those things as well, sort of like picking nearer to the bridge. That can give like a real different tone to a piece of music and stuff like that, and really make the part pop out a bit more. So that was another kind of thing, you know, in the studio or something. Presumably he's tried, you know, getting these kind of tones from an amp and thinking, well, what would actually sit in this mix? Actually, this kind of doinky was what he called it, guitar sound. I thought that was a really interesting idea. One other thing that I know that he's talked about before, and I think this could be important for like function gigs and stuff like that, is the level at which you monitor your own guitar part relative to the rest of the band or the rest of the mix. What he's talking about there is, you know, if you have your guitar lower in the mix relative to the others, you get a better sense of maybe what the guitar part would sound like once it's actually recorded, because I think that's typically the case for me, is when I've listened to my parts back, if I've been involved in recording sessions and stuff like that, or sent guitar parts to someone, the guitar parts are normally way further down in the mix than I would have had them ideally, given that I am the guitarist who recorded them. And so that's another kind of perspective to have on these things. Not only that, I think it helps you to listen to kind of the timekeeping elements a little bit better as well. That's another really key piece of advice that I saw from Tom Bukovac video a little while back. The one thing that I wanted to add to this from my own personal experience, because I think this has helped me in life in general. Very early on, I had a guy that ran a studio in Sussex that used to come to visit. I asked like his advice for like how would I become a session player, or what would he say to a session player. And one of the really key pieces of advice that he said was about learning all your scales. So I guess not being a guitarist who's like just in two kind of positions. I guess maybe things like cage might help with that, and just being familiar with the fretboard in general and how that works, which is a whole other topic. But really key advice, learn to play in every single key so you don't have these blind spots. Because what happens, I think, in studios and sessions, you get songs that are written by players that are not guitarists, and these things like A flat major, E flat major, D flat major, G flat major, or F sharp major, these keys that can seem like, well, I wouldn't ever write a piece of music in these keys. The in-between keys, I like to think of them as, are actually really quite difficult to play in if you don't get used to playing them. So I took that personally from a very early kind of point, like maybe 11, 12, 13. And from that point on, I would actively seek out trying to play in these keys that were difficult and unfamiliar to me. And I think that has been beneficial, because now it feels basically equal to me to play in any key, whether it's C major, D flat major, A flat, F sharp major. It's kind of, that's been really useful. I think that is good advice. I don't know if Tom would agree if he saw this video. Something that I think has really helped me, and I wanted to pass that on. So I think some really good advice from Tom in that video. Go check it out if you haven't already. And again, thank you to Tom for sharing this kind of stuff, because I think it's a really interesting perspective. You know, 99.9% of us are never going to be in the situation where we get to do 30 years of session playing. So it's really cool to hear from players who are. It also sounds like the session scene, even in Nashville, is kind of, like Tom says in this video, getting to a stage where actually it's like a lot of the producers are players themselves. And so maybe even, I think he expressed some frustration in this video about being like a pro, and you have the producer basically sits through the session with you and then gets home, mutes it all, and then plays all the parts themselves. Yeah, an interesting kind of situation. And I guess my advice, if you're waiting for an opportunity, is that it might not come along. So you need to kind of be acting like it's going to happen anyway, and making your own music. And then when it eventually happens, like if an opportunity does come, hopefully you're able to nail it, because I don't think these opportunities come too soon. So you should be, I think, working on full arrangements. You should be working on picking apart songs, writing your own songs, maybe singing parts if you can, and just trying to be the best kind of all-round listener and player that you can be. I think is good advice if you want to become a session player. And I think Tom would probably echo some of that. Cheers for stopping by. And yeah, cheers Tom.